Welcome to part two of remembering the Second Seminole War. Hopefully you can remember part one and we'll go on to part two. This time we'll actually get to the war. So where we left off here was in December 1835. Major Dade was marching his men, his 100-plus troops from Fort Brooke up to Fort King, as I said, from Tampa to Ocala. And late December, December 28th, 1835, you have what's known as the Dade Massacre, the Dade Battle. Essentially, his men are marching and there are Seminoles who are basically trailing alongside of them. And they catch them really completely off guard. And it really is an annihilation. It's a complete victory for the Seminoles in that battle. You could argue that probably it led to ultimately, in the long run, many Seminoles being moved out of the Florida and many Seminoles dying. But in the short run, this manages to start the Second Seminole War. There are a couple other events that occur in November and December at that time period that also might be seen as the first shots fired. But I think this guarantees that there will be a Second Seminole War. And this really puts the war on the nation's radar. I mean, here it is, 100-plus soldiers being killed in the far-off frontier. What's going to happen next? And so the war begins. You can see on this map, the war is really a series. There are a lot of conflicts, a lot of battles here. But trust me, by any standard, certainly by later 19th century standards of the Civil War, these are small battles, which is why when you're driving throughout Florida, you don't necessarily see big, military battlefields or anything associated with these things. But it also shows you how the geographic extent, traveling from down close to Fort Lauderdale. Now these battles somewhere at the top are really from the First Seminole War, not the Second Seminole War, but certainly in this area around Orlando, you can see some conflicts there. So battle takes 7 years, involves 10,000 troops. A little cartoon here says all he remembers is the Alamo, and that's really going on about the same time. People remember the Alamo, but they don't remember Dade's battle. They don't remember the Battle of Lake Okeechobee. They don't battle of Wahoo Swamp. They don't remember any of those. And why not? And I think here are some reasons here. First of all, you could argue that it's not significant for U.S. history. Now you think about this. When you're telling a story of U.S. history, a lot of times the story is progress, and certainly for a long period, that's what historians always taught. We started in the colonial period, and today we've achieved almost perfection. We've gone away from that story of American history. But when you look at the 19th century U.S. history, think about what are people talking about this time? They're working their way up to the Civil War. So when you're working your way up to the Civil War, this doesn't really fit into the narrative of that. This isn't about slavery and slavery's expansion. It is, we said, could be called a Negro War, but it's not really about the expansion of slavery here. It's not really about the rise of political parties. So a lot of the stories, the themes that people talk about in U.S. history, the Seminole War doesn't really fit into. It does fit into the Trail of Tears. It doesn't fit into Indian removal. But when we're checking off boxes in our history books, we use the Cherokee to check off that box, not the Seminoles. Also, while some people would argue the nation was fixated by Florida during this period, I don't really think that's true. I mean, Florida is the frontier. Nobody was planning to move down to Florida. Nobody was coming to visit Disney World. Nobody was thinking, okay, what am I going to do on my summer vacation? Let's go down. Maybe we could see a rocket blast off at the Cape. No, I mean, basically, Florida was this mysterious land of alligators and swamps and mosquitoes and hurricanes, none of which sound really something you really want to go visit. So we're talking about a very few people live here, and most of this battle occurs even beyond the frontier of where those people live. So it wasn't necessarily, this wasn't the United States fighting for its second war of independence. It wasn't fighting for the future of the United States. You could argue that what was going on here, it didn't really affect, if you were a Michigan farmer, I don't know exactly how the Battle of Wahoo Swamp's results affected you one way or another. It certainly didn't affect your daily life. So unless you're one of the soldiers who have volunteered, or unless you're trying to balance the federal budget, you could argue the Second Seminole War was not particularly significant in a day-to-day basis. Plus, while it takes 7 years, it's not as if there's constant fighting during that time period. There are a lot of times where, especially the summers, where no one's fighting at all. So it's intermittent fighting during those 7 years, small battles. Also, second reason is no clear goal. What was the objective? When you fight a war, armies are good at destroying things, killing people, but the idea is that war, famous Clausewitz saying, war is politics by other means. The war needs to try to achieve something. What is the goal of this war? General Jessup? We're the only commanders who have ever been required to go into an unexplored wilderness, catch savages, remove them to another wilderness. Search all history in another instance is not to be found. A lot of times the goal of war is to capture the other side's capital, to gain this territory, to destroy these resources. You could argue the goal of this war is to really capture every single Seminole and move them out to Indian territory. That's going to be almost impossible to do, especially given the fact that there are the Everglades and other areas of Florida that are not very well populated. So it's really a difficult goal to achieve, and the U.S. Army it's almost impossible for them to achieve it. By 1837, 2 years into the war, Jessup thinks that we should just say, okay, we've moved, or we've gotten to agree, 80, 90% of the Seminoles to agree to move. Let's just leave a few hundred in the Everglades. And that's what Jessup says in 1837, and the federal government says, nope, got to move them all. 5 years later, the federal government does exactly what Jessup had suggested they do in 1837. They declare victory and leave a few hundred Seminoles in the Everglades. So you have this conflict where there's no clear goals. It's also not easy to find the enemy here. Here you have the examples of where you can see the terrain is also possibly part of the enemy here. The enemy can be well hidden, and the enemy in many cases, given the weather, given the brackish water, given the mosquitoes, the environment literally is the enemy as well. So ideally, you'd want to apply constant pressure to the Seminoles during this time period. But given the fact it's so difficult to apply pressure, so difficult to communicate across the state, that was hard for the U.S. Army to do. Also in that similar vein, there are no front lines here. While we look at these battles all over the place here, it's not as if 1835 the U.S. Army was in the middle of the state and had advanced to 1837. There's no, the Seminoles moved around. They could be in Everglades at some point. They moved back up in the state at various points here. It's always difficult to fight a war where there are not front lines, because all of a sudden the United States Army could be down at Lake Okeechobee and there could be a Seminole attack around somewhere by Orlando. In fact, one could argue the last 5 years of the war, what the U.S. Army really did was build forts. They built roads and forts around here, and there's so many Florida cities named for forts, but I think closest here you could say Fort Christmas would be an example of a fort that dates from the Second Seminole time period. Also, there are most conflicts we associate with great heroes. Who's the greatest general in the Civil War? U.S. Grant or Robert E. Lee or whoever else you're going to pick, Sherman, Jackson. In World War II, you talk about an Eisenhower or other great generals there. Well, who are the great heroes of the Second Seminole War? And there really aren't. The names you might recognize: Major Francis Dade. Of course, I grew up in Dade County, which is now Miami-Dade County. Hard to argue that he's a great military hero. Essentially, he marched his men into a tragic ambush and got killed in that tragic ambush. Zachary Taylor. Fights at the Battle of Okeechobee in basically Christmas Day, more or less, 1837. He declares victory. It's debatable whether he actually achieved victory, but he does use that eventually. He leaves Florida shortly thereafter, and then will go fight in Mexico, and he'll translate that into the White House, where he spends 2 years as president before he passes away. So maybe Zachary Taylor's someone who rises out of Florida, but given the fact that he fights a battle where it's unclear whether he won or not, it's hard to say that makes him a hero. Jessup, we've already alluded to. Jessup talks about the idea this could be a Negro War. Jessup talks about the idea of ending the war in 1837. Jessup's probably most infamous for capturing Osceola, a Seminole chief, under a flag of truce. Not exactly something that you want to be known for. Here it is, you declare a truce, come in to negotiate, and you have your men arrest the leader on the other side, throw him in jail, where Osceola will subsequently die. Some people argue that's why, what do we name after Jessup? Lake Jessup here north of Orlando, famous for its abundance of alligators. So I guess there is this sort of negative side to Jessup there. Another name that we know in this area associated with Captain William Maitland. The town of Maitland, which is sort of north of Winter Park, is named after William Maitland. Well, hard to argue he's a great military war hero. He fights at Withlacoochee. I think he fights at Wahoo Swamp. He's wounded. He suffers from a wound to the head, suffers probably from PTSD, and as he's on the boats going to the north, I think maybe outside of Charleston, he throws himself over and commits suicide. Now, if you actually go to the Wikipedia page for Maitland, which is why you can't always trust Wikipedia pages, it says he died in the battle, but that's pretty clear it's not the case. He might have died slightly of results of the wound. He died maybe from his wound causing delirium, coupled by PTSD, caused him to kill himself, but hardly a war hero in this case. So probably the greatest hero that Americans recognize then and now from the war is Osceola. Osceola was the famous Seminole leader. As I said, here you see this in the top left-hand corner there. The arrest of Osceola. Here he is, comes to negotiate, and rather than negotiate, he's thrown into prison and will die in a military prison. So Osceola represents sort of the renegade, represents the fighter here. Of course, he is most famously these days represents the symbol of the Florida State football team, which was a very proud symbol for most of the years I've given this lecture. I think more recently it's probably more of a dumpster fire of a football team than it has been in the past, but I think that he is sort of this idea, this is, the rebel who fights against overwhelming odds. We like an underdog, and Osceola is the underdog of this conflict. So the problem, as I already alluded to, in 1837, the U.S. government wants to end this war, but it's hard to end a war. Easy to start a war, hard to end a war, and it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. The government will continue the war. The Indians no longer have any confidence in the white race, and the vice versa, the white race and the Indians. It's hard to negotiate with people when you've captured one of their leaders when they come in to negotiate. So nobody trusts the other side in this war. The officers appear to be completely discouraged. The Indians are in every part of the country in parties of 2 or 3, and there's no prospect or probability of catching them nor of ending the war. And this is what you have to do. Essentially capture every one of them. If there are 2 or 3 or a family here or there, are you really going to think about how many soldiers that would require? So the war drags on. Really, most major conflict is done by 1837. The war drags on for 5 more nasty, sickly, warm, hurricane years after that before the United States decides, okay, leaving 300 Seminoles in the Everglades is not really going to tilt the balance of anything in the United States. And in fact, while you have 300 Seminoles here in the south part of the state, that isn't enough for people who are truly fans of Indian removal, and so it's the never-ending war, because if you notice, not only there's a first Seminole War and a second Seminole War, but there's a third Seminole War that'll take place in the 1850s. And at that point, finally, the U.S. gives up and says, hey, you know what, some Seminoles could stay. And of course, you could argue that the Seminoles have done okay for themselves, whether it's the Hard Rock Casino or other financial endeavors, and the Seminoles who stayed here have ultimately prospered, but certainly not in the short run. In the short run, 90+% of the Seminoles are probably either killed or sent out to Indian territory. What has the United States gained by this? Hard to say. They've lost soldiers, about 1,500 soldiers. They've spent money, and essentially they've moved the Seminoles 300 miles to the south. So you can see why we forget about this war. The war does not have great heroes, does not have great results. Hopefully you will not forget about this war, and hopefully you've enjoyed these 2 mini lectures. Thank you.